Hello and welcome to Little Learners. Last week I posted a video about behaviour management. I gave 10 tips, and in that video I mentioned Timeout. Some of you asked for a kind of longer video about this, something a little bit more in depth, and that's what we have today. So I'm going to start off by going through the steps of how I do a timeout, and then after that I'll give a little bit more information about where and when and all of that kind of thing. Before we get started, don't forget to join the Little Learners family by clicking the subscribe button and hitting that bell. Okay, so step one is always a warning. So I never give a timeout straight away unless it is really necessary. So for example, if there has been a fight, that doesn't really happen in reception, or just something very violent, then a timeout happens straight away. But usually we give a warning first so that children are able to rectify their behaviour. It means that we're giving them a choice. So I tell them that this behaviour, explain what the behaviour is not acceptable, and if it happens again, then you will have a timeout. Step two, when the behaviour is repeated, that is when I issue the timeout. So get down to the child's level, explain to them that the behaviour, tell them what the behaviour was, is not acceptable. I already gave you a warning, and I said that if you did it again, you would have a timeout. You have done it again, and so now we are going to time out. It's important not to get into any kind of conversation at this point. If the child is shouting or wants to say, it's not fair, it's not my fault, that is not okay right now. There will be time for that later, which I will get to. But for now, you just explain, and then we move to the timeout spot. Step three is when we get to the timeout, the child sits down, and I then explain again why they are on timeout, because it's very important that they understand why they are there. I then explain how much time the child has to stay on the timeout. So usually I use teacher time for this, so I'll tell them they have 4 minutes if they are 4 years old, and then I kind of gauge it with teacher time, trying to keep an eye on the clock, but it's really hard when you're in the classroom. If you're a parent, this is much easier possibly at home if you've just got the one child or even two. For some children it may be more appropriate to use a sand timer or just some kind of timer. You'll know if that's appropriate for that child and if that will give them a little bit more structure and understanding of the timeout. Step 3.5. So this one only comes into play if the child gets up off of the timeout. So every time they get up and move away from timeout, they get taken back there and the time starts again. So if you have that sound timer or any kind of timer, you put it back to 0. This is very important because I want the children to understand that the behaviour equals a consequence, and that consequence has to be fulfilled in its entirety. So if you sit on the timeout chair, for example, and you're getting up every 10 seconds throughout that 4 minutes, you're not actually doing the timeout. So there are very strict rules to the timeout and they must be followed. If you are a parent doing timeouts at home, it's much easier because you can physically pick up your child and put them back on the chair. With teachers, it's slightly different, so it depends which school you are at. So if your school allows you to pick up children, and usually in nursery and reception that is fine, but obviously check with your school, you can pick them up and put them back on the timeout chair. However, if your school does not allow you to pick up children, then you just need to explain to them that they need to go back to the chair and that they are not allowed to do anything until they have done their timeout. This can be a little bit more laborious, and when you start giving timeouts, it can take a long time, but persevere, trust me. Step 4 is when the timeout is finished. I go back to the child, get down to their level because obviously they're sitting down at this point, and explain to them again why they were on the timeout, what the behaviour was. I explained to them that I gave you a warning, I gave you a choice to change your behaviour and you didn't, just so the child really has a clear idea of why they are there and why they had a timeout. Also, after 4 minutes, it's very possible they will have forgotten. Step 5 is to ask the child if they have anything to say. Usually you're looking for an apology here, but sometimes there might be some other things that they want to get off their chest as well. They've had some time to sit and think about it, and now it's your turn to listen. This is the time that children can have the conversation with you that they wanted to have when you gave them the timeout. Usually that happens that they're trying to chat to you, and that is not what we do. We go straight to timeout. We do not have a chat. This is the time to have a chat. And number 6 is kind of a sign that everything has been dealt with and we are moving on now. So this can be a hug or a high five, just something to show that it's all over and we are going to move on. Okay, so those are kind of 6.5 rules to my timeouts. That's how I give them. So for a little bit more detail, I wanted to talk about when it's appropriate to give timeouts. So I kind of explained this already, that if it's behaviour that is unacceptable and you've given a warning and that behaviour is repeated, then it's time for a timeout. However, timeouts do not always work for all children, and I think that's very important to understand. Children can only benefit from timeouts if they really understand the concept of a timeout and if they understand why they are being given it. So for example, I might have had a child with special educational needs, and their need means that they can't really grasp the concept of a timeout or the fact that their behaviour was unacceptable. And so that means that discipline and behaviour management is a little bit different. There are also times when you do need to talk first. So if two children are having a row and you've told them to stop having a row and they're still having a row, that is not necessarily something that you want to give a timeout for. That is something that you want to sit them both down and talk to them about and get them to understand how to compromise or kind of go through conflict and resolution exercises with them. So you don't want to be giving timeouts all the time. I think that's a very important. I hardly ever give timeouts, and honestly, once I had given them a few times at the beginning of the year, I didn't really have to give them for the rest of the year because they do work if they're followed through. So obviously use your best judgment. Does that behaviour management style of a timeout fit that child? Will they be able to understand? And does it also fit the behaviour that they have been exhibiting, or is there a different route you need to go down to resolve that behaviour? The next thing I think it's important to talk about is where do you have your timeout spot? In my classroom, I didn't really find it feasible to have one place where timeout was because I need to use all of my classroom. So timeout was wherever I said it was, and it was more of a concept than a space or a spot, which I think is important. I have two cousins who, when they were little, used to have a naughty step, and that worked really well, but whenever they went up the stairs, they skipped the naughty step because it was a place that was not a good place to be in. And so I think it's important to bring it back to kind of the concept and the behaviour rather than the actual place. So in my classroom, I would just get a chair and put it wherever I wanted the timeout to be. Sometimes that was inside the classroom. Most of the time, if it was outside of the classroom, it had to be a time when I was free to keep checking on the child, or if there was another adult present outside of the classroom. In the corridor, I didn't, put them out in the rain, because obviously you are a little bit more constricted to where you can place children when you're in a classroom and you have 29 other children to look after. If you're a parent doing this at home, it might be a bit easier to have a place or kind of a spot or a chair that you always use, but I do think that because you need to be able to use timeouts wherever you are, it's important to not just have it as one place, because if you're out somewhere, you might still need to give a timeout. Obviously, it's very important not to place them anywhere where they can get to toys and fun things. Definitely don't put them anywhere where they can see the TV. This needs to be quiet reflection time. In a classroom, it's difficult for it to be quiet because you're in a classroom, and you just have to decide whether or not you want it to be right where all the other children are playing, or if you want it to be slightly out of the way, which I think usually is best, because this isn't a embarrassment exercise. You don't want the other children to be teasing or anything like that. This is really to reflect the behaviour. I suppose really the only other thing I would say was that you have to be very consistent and very firm. Please do not shout during timeouts. That is not kind of going to be helpful for anyone. We just need to make sure that we are calm, firm and consistent with timeouts. We don't want this to be a huge battle, although I will admit that at the beginning, especially if you're a parent with your child, it probably will be a bit of a battle at the beginning, because this is a new behaviour management style that they're not used to yet. And of course, children are always pushing the boundaries, and that's kind of their job as a child. With parents, they are more likely to act up, I think, usually because they feel much more comfortable at home and able to let loose, whereas at school children do kind of hold it in a little bit. So it can be a little bit difficult for parents, but it's really important to stay consistent. Even if the first time out you do takes half an hour because they keep getting up and you keep having to take them back, it's really important that you stay consistent, because if you don't, you are completely undermining yourself. If you have any other questions, do leave them in the comment box below. Don't forget to like this video if you found it helpful. It really helps out the channel when we get those thumbs up. I mentioned earlier that I posted a video called 10 tips for behaviour management, so I will link that in the description box as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.